10 minutes.
I was wondering if the Minister is okay to go backwards and forwards a little bit with questions. I suppose firstly I'd just like to welcome the opportunity to discuss biodiversity here today. I raised the issue with Deputy Bruton, Minister Bruton last week because fundamentally biodiversity and its capacity as a nature-based solution in relation to climate change and dealing with climate change adaptation plus mitigation, it is hugely important, and I think it is one area where we haven't given it the emphasis that it requires, and we also don't value it and don't see the potential in it. But climate change and biodiversity are intrinsically linked. We will not be able to address climate change without also addressing biodiversity and using nature-based solutions to address climate change, and vice versa. Our biodiversity will be impacted heavily by climate change, and we need to address those two things in tandem. Essentially, climate change and biodiversity are two heads of the same coin. There is a lot of good work happening locally. We have the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, which really has enabled individuals and residents groups and businesses and councils to really impact and make a difference at a grassroots level in relation to the biodiversity in our towns and villages. We've also this year seen the excellent biodiversity handbook that has gone out to a lot of houses, and I think that has really given something for not just children but adults to inspire them to make a difference in their own garden and their own street. And I think that work is really important, and I want to acknowledge it and commend it. But grassroots action can only go so far when it comes to the important issue of biodiversity, and I think we need to have leadership and a national vision as what we want to see for our country when it comes to biodiversity. When I think about an Ireland that is very, very strong and robust in its nature and its biodiversity, one that is very rich from a natural perspective, it would look to me like a series of core, protected, heavily protected areas that we have we place no pressure on it from an economic perspective, a recreation perspective, a tourism perspective. We just essentially let nature be, let it regulate itself, and it will find its own balance. We would also then need to connect those with areas where people can go out and enjoy, but we also give a level of protection to biodiversity in those areas, and really create, I suppose, a web across our countryside to enable our biodiversity to move and find space and protection in those areas, and then connect to our urban areas where our towns and villages are as environmentally friendly as possible, where we have green buildings and green streets, where our developers have to use the hedgerows that are there to ensure that we provide as many habitats and environments for nature to grow and expand. That's the kind of vision that has actually been outlined in the last few weeks in the EU biodiversity strategy. And Minister, so my first question to you is, the last time we spoke on biodiversity in this chamber, I think it was only the day after the EU biodiversity strategy had been launched, and you hadn't had an opportunity at that stage to read it. But my understanding was, you mentioned in the Dáil that you were going to have a meeting with the Parliamentary State Secretary to the German Federal Minister on the biodiversity strategy. And I was just wondering, Minister, my first question would be, what were the outcomes of that meeting, and I suppose what are the next steps in relation to that strategy, and is this something that the Department can support in its current form?
Yeah, you have a good memory, Deputy Whitmore. Yes, I had a meeting with Deputy Bruton and the German Minister in relation to climate change in general, but obviously most of the remit was under or Minister Bruton's, I should say, Minister Bruton's remit, but I did deal with the biodiversity aspect. You know, the EU's new Green Deal states that by 2030, member states legally have to protect at least 30% of the EU's land and marine areas, and that 10% of these will be strictly protected. And from Ireland, this will mean a doubling of the protected area on land and a trebling in the marine area. And Ireland, you know, we discussed basically a lot of what I'm saying here. You know, for Ireland, this will mean a doubling, as I said, of the protected area of land and a trebling in the marine area. And we're making good progress on land designations, including NHAs, SACs and SPAs, and any further designations we were of the view would need to be done in partnership with the owners and the users of the lands affected, as it must be done in a transparent manner. And I certainly know from my own experience in this department is that if you try and ramrod changes, particularly in relation to climate change, and that's why we have the Just Transition, it doesn't work. So you really need to bring people with you. So we had a discussion around that, and it was a very positive discussion. It is the EU, we're a member of the EU, we're a member state in the EU, so obviously there has to be joined up thinking. It's interesting to learn from other countries how they're dealing with the proposals that are in it, and we'll continue to do that. Biodiversity, as we know, and nature are crucial to our health and our ability to sustain life. And we all recognise the need and the urgent need to reverse biodiversity loss. So we're going to try and attempt to do that by seeking to reverse declines in habitat richness, to increase biodiversity, to manage emerging threats from pollutants and invasive species, and expand national park areas. We're also going to implement, as I mentioned earlier, the third National Biodiversity Action Plan and develop a successor action plan for the period beyond 2021. And I'm not sure if you've read the programme for government yet, there's innumerable elements to that and tasks in that going forward we could revolutionise, I think, the way biodiversity is looked upon in this country, and we can improve our water quality in lakes, our rivers, our streams, our seas and our coastlines.
Thank you, Minister. I've gone through the EU biodiversity strategy, and there's a lot of really good things in it. And as you say, there's a commitment to provide a minimum of 30% of not just terrestrial areas, but also marine areas. And then within that, to have a heavily protected area of 10%, which would be quite a significant change from where we are at the moment, but I do think it's an important place that we're heading towards. Now, those commitments in the EU are for 2030, so there will be a lot of work. As you say, it is best in these instances to bring people with you. So there will be a lot of work involved in actually getting us from the point where we are at the moment to a place where we have 30% of our land and water protected. I'm just wondering, is the government in principle okay with those targets? Do you agree with the 30% target? I suppose you referenced the programme from government, and there wasn't actually any targets in that in relation to any land or marine protected areas. So I'm just wondering what the government's thinking is on that 30% commitment by the EU, and whether you would envisage at this point in time that the government will sign up to that. And then also what steps the department are taking to make sure that we can actually reach it. There will be a lot of mapping, monitoring, and work really on the ground that will be required in order to identify ecologically coherent land and marine areas that would be suitable for these kinds of protections. Thank you.
Yeah, there have to be targets. I mean, if you think about the fact that 14% of our land is already designated, it is quite substantial. We have 440 SACs, we have 150 NHAs, and we have 154 SPAs. You get used to the anagrams pretty quickly in this department, but we will look at the targets, and I think to meet the needs of the EU strategy, it's recognised that at least 20 billion a year should be unlocked for spending on nature, and that a significant proportion of the 25% of the EU budget dedicated to climate action will be invested in biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And we should ensure that we maximise these opportunities to increase the resilience of biodiversity to climate change. And my officials, I know, are still examining the contents of the EU strategy, and we're liaising with other key departments. And I'm looking, any engagement that you wish to give to us, I very much welcome that. And we're in the process of developing a very strong set of positions for nature and biodiversity that will feed into the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is due to be adopted at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity meetings next year. So I think that should be of assistance. And, in the programme for government, there's, one of the things that we've written is to conduct a baseline biodiversity study on every farm to inform future policy developments. And then there's a whole litany of other areas about reviewing natural heritage protections, including hedgerows. There's the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity. We have committed to bring that forward within 100 days of a new government being formed. Promoting biodiversity in schools, primary schools, post-primary schools and third-level sectors, and to ensure that schools and colleges and universities across the country play an active role in providing areas to promote biodiversity, and also to support biodiversity data collection and to publish the new National Pollinator Plan as well. Thank you.
Minister.